Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone's having a nice day. And today's Torah portion is doubled. We got a double portion. It all begins if you're in the blue Art Scroll Chumash on page 900. But if you're in any other Chumash following along, just go to the last two Torah portions of the book of Bamidbar, which is the book of the wilderness, or also known in English as the book of Numbers. So we're ready to begin our double Torah portion. There are a lot of very fundamental subjects in this week's Torah portion. So we'll go through them as much as we can. So the Torah portion of Matot begins with a very fundamental, critical, and important subject, something that we could really apply every day of our lives. You know, someone's told me, I've never been in the Diamond District much, but they told me that in the Diamond District, for some reason, I don't know if this is still today, hopefully it is, they have a custom, a lot of Jews in the Diamond District in New York City, that when they do a business deal, they shake hands and they say, maybe today with coronavirus, they don't shake hands, but they say mazel and bracha. And, you know, I guess because the Jews are so prominent in the Diamond District, they came up with these two words, success and blessing. And someone told me that it's remarkable, and again, I don't, never seen this firsthand, but you could verify it perhaps if this is still the case, but there was definitely a period that this is the way it was, that people would exchange a bag of diamonds or a pouch of diamonds, sometimes, you know, very expensive, valuable, you know, thousands and thousands of dollars, and forget about a contract, you know, just not even a piece of paper, just a handshake and two words, mazel and bracha. And somehow there was so much trust and honesty and integrity in this field, in this industry, that people were confident and secure just with those two words, mazel and bracha. So we know today we have lawyers, people lawyer up, contracts, they try to get out of contracts, a word here, a word there. Well, what does the Torah say? So in the opening of this week's Torah portion, we have a very, very beautiful verse. Again, all the verses of the Torah are beautiful, but just something that we could really enrich our lives with every day if we practice it. And it says the following. It says, when you make a vow, which doesn't mean that you have to go put your hand on a Bible, on a Torah in a court of law, but you actually just say you're going to do something. So the Torah says, Lo yachel devaro. You should not profane your words. It's in the very second verse of this opening Torah portion. But rather, kechol hayotze mipiv yaaseh. Whatever comes out of your mouth, you must do. If you say something, you must do it. Your word is your bond, as we say. And if you don't do what you said, you profaned your words. You've desecrated, so to speak. Your words are holy. Your words are sacred. Your words should be considered sacred in your eyes. And if you don't do what you said you're going to do, then you have desecrated your own words. Now, this is such an important subject. Now, somebody put a comment about the Siddur. We're not in the Siddur. We're in the Chumash, in the Torah, okay? So, to just show you the significance of words, and again, in our society, people minimize the importance of words. It's just words, you know, free speech, say what you want. From the Torah's perspective, if you gave your word to do something, you are legally bound. It's as binding as a contract. You need two witnesses who heard you say it in order to enforce it in a court of law. But from your own perspective, if you said something, you are bound to it. You are obligated to fulfill whatever comes out of your mouth. I've shared the story many times. It's a story my father shared with me. My father's a principal in a school, but in the early years, he was a teacher. And he told me a story that he went for a job interview once, and they offered him a teaching job, and he said he would take it. And before he had a chance to come and sign a contract or anything like that, before the school year began, a few days later, or whatever it was, someone offered him another teaching job for a higher salary. And it wasn't a small difference, it was a significant difference. And my father went to the rabbi of the community, whose name is Rabbi Michael Dworkin, not related to our Dworkin, but his name was Rabbi Dworkin. And he said, what should I do? I'd rather take the job that pays more. However, I did tell them I would work for this other school. Rabbi worked and said, if you gave your word according to Torah law, you have to keep it, even if it means you're going to take home a smaller paycheck, okay? And another story that my father would tell me is that when my parents bought their first house in Borough Park, I was a little child then. They moved out of an apartment. They bought a house. And it was an Italian man they bought the house from. And they came, they looked at the house, and the man, this was back in, must have been in the 70s. And they agreed upon a price without writing a contract. They agreed, I think the price was $65,000. And when they came back to finalize the deal, the guy said someone else came and offered them $67,000, which $2,000 was a lot of money in those days. But he said, I gave my word to you. I'm going to keep my word. So in business, being honest, having integrity, if you gave someone your word, that's a commandment in this week's Torah portion. Now, to show you the significance of words in Judaism, we all know the holiest day of the year is Yom Kippur. Now, when Jews come to shul on the opening night of Yom Kippur, we begin with a prayer called Kol Nidrei. Now, the evening is called Kol Nidrei. I went to Kol Nidrei. We don't even say we went to Yom Kippur services. We went to Kol Nidrei. These two words, Kol Nidrei, any vows. The word Nidarim is this week's Torah portion. All the laws of Nidarim, of taking vows, of keeping your word. And Kol Nidrei is a prayer saying, if I haven't lived up to my words, and it's a prayer for forgiveness and absolution. So it's all based on this week's Torah portion. The opening section of the Yom Kippur service is based on this week's Torah portion. Because we cannot begin Yom Kippur before we look at the promises we've made, and we've kept those promises. Now, there can be many reasons why. One reason is because Yom Kippur is about how we resolve to do better in the coming year. Well, what about last year's promises that we made? Did we live up to those promises that we made to ourselves or to others, the commitments, the pledges, or the resolutions that we took upon ourselves? So words, and I'll just tell you something that people think always about words that you say to others. And I want you to think about something else. What about the words you say to yourself that no one else hears? They're not even audible. You make a promise to yourself. You make a resolution to yourself. Surely if you told someone else you're going to do something, you're obligated to keep it. That's the commandment in the Torah. But on a deeper level, a more subtle level, even if you didn't articulate it to others, if you made a resolution for yourself, you promised yourself something, that also counts. That also matters. I love to tell the story that I once heard about this man who was in the garment district. You know, he was shopping around looking for a materials, and he went into a certain fabric store, and he said, "I need this and this material. Do you sell it?" They said, "Yeah." He said, "How much is it?" He said, $12 a yard. He said, "I need 100 yards. How much is 100 yards?" He said, 100 yards is $1,200. He said, "Aren't you going to give me a discount if I'm buying 100 yards?" He said, "No, this is a very good price. I can't afford to give you a discount. It's the same price. It's going to be $1,200. So the guy said, "Okay, let me go shop around. I'll come back." He walked up and down the avenue, went to every other fabric store, asked about the same fabric. And it turns out everyone else wanted $14, $15, $16. He realized that, indeed, even at 100 yards, at $12 was a great deal. So he goes back to the store and he says, "Okay, I'll take the 100 yards. The guy says, "Fine." He wraps it up for him and he hands him the bill for $1,100. He says, "I don't understand. You told me it's $12 a yard. You won't give me a discount. Why are you charging me only $1,100? And the owner of the store said, "I'll tell you what happened. When you left the store, I regretted what I did. I said to myself, I bought this material for $10 a yard. I was being greedy. I wanted $12. I should have given it to you for $11. I still would have made $100. Why did I lose a customer?" So I made a resolution in my mind that if someone else comes back and wants, if ever someone asks for 100 yards, I'll give them $1 off. So you're the first person who came back and asked for 100 yards. I'm going to give you what I promised myself I would do for the next customer who asked for 100 yards. So even the words you say to yourself. Now, there's certain words we say to ourselves that are negative. And those are the vows that That's what this week's Torah portion talks about. What's if I made a vow, not realizing the consequences of the vow? So, for example, I'll give you an extreme example. I get into a disagreement with someone, and I take a vow, and I say, I'm never going to talk to you for the rest of my life. It's a horrible thing to say, but I took such a vow. And then I realized that I need to talk to this person because it's chronic. He's a family member, and it's going to create problems in my marriage or problems in my family. So when I said the words, I wasn't thinking about all the ramifications and the consequences of my words. So I could go to 3 rabbis, and I could explain that when I said what I said, I didn't realize the full impact of what I was saying and how it would affect my life. And therefore, I now am seeking absolution from this vow. And there's a way to undo vows. So sometimes we say things that are negative, that we don't recognize how harmful they're going to be to ourselves. And the first subject of this Torah portion is how we can absolve our vows, and how we have to make sure that when we say something, unless it's negative and it's going to have a harmful effect, in which case we have to undo the vow. If it's positive, we have to make sure we fulfill our words. But I want to share with you something else that Talmud says, which is quite interesting. Talmud says that what happens if a person takes a vow to do something contrary to the Torah? So I gave an example. I vow I'm never going to speak to this person again, or I vow I'm never going to give money to this organization again, or whatever vow I take, and then I realize it's the wrong thing to do. I really should give tzedakah. I really should talk to this person. I really should help this person. But in anger or whatever, I did the wrong thing. I took a vow. So there's a concept in the Talmud that says like this: when the Jewish people came to Mount Sinai, we took a vow to God. We took a vow to God that we would obey and observe his commandments. And therefore, the Talmud says that, let's say I took a vow to someone, and then I take a vow contrary to the vow that I took to the first person. So the second vow is not binding because I cannot take that vow. I don't have the power to take the second vow because I've already made a vow to the first person. So since I've already made a vow to the first person, the second vow never takes effect because I don't have the power to take that vow because I've already committed to someone else contrary to this new vow that I'm taking. And the same thing with God. Everything in the Torah, every Jew vowed to observe. When we said, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and we will listen to all of God's commandments, we took a vow to be faithful to the Torah. And therefore, if a Jew takes a vow contrary, for example, a Jew says, I promise you I will come and work for you on Shabbat. And then he says, 1 minute, it's Shabbat, I can't work. The vow never took effect in the first place because you already took a vow to God at the 10 Commandments that you're going to keep the day of Shabbat, that you will not work on Shabbat. So anything else that's the contrary to it is not binding in the first place. Just like if you have a contract that you sold your house to somebody, and then you write a second contract that you're selling it to someone else. If you already had a contract to the first person, the first contract supersedes and overrides any subsequent contract. It's not binding because you already signed the earlier document that you're giving it to this person. So too, we already pre-signed a document with God that we would obey his commandments and do the good thing, the righteous thing always. And therefore, if we ever take a vow that we're going to do something that's not righteous, that is not proper, that is not good in the eyes of Hashem, we're going contrary to our initial vow to Hashem, and therefore it's not binding and effective in the first place. That is the opening subject of this week's Torah portion, obviously at great length. The second subject in this double Torah portion, which begins with chapter 31 in the book of Numbers, the book of Bamidbar, is about the war against Midian. Now, if you recall, Midian were the ones who seduced the Jewish men to sin with them and worship the idol of Baal Peor, and that's when Pinchas stood up and dealt with the leader of Shimon, who was engaging with the Moabite, with the Midianite woman. But now there was a war, and one of the major subjects in this week's Torah portion is the spoils, the booty from the battle, which Pinchas led this battle because he began the mitzvah by fighting against Midian. He concluded, our rabbis teach us a very important principle: if you begin a good deed, you should conclude it or continue it. But one of the outcomes of this section in chapter 31 about the war and the booty of the spoils being divided is the laws of koshering utensils. Because when they took the utensils from the Midianite people, when they won the war, they had to cleanse them. They had to kosher them. Now, anyone who has a Jewish home is familiar with the subject of koshering. Koshering is, what do you do when you have utensils that are not kosher? Either because they were used prior for non-kosher purposes, or there was an accident and you mixed milk and meat, let's say, in a pot. So you need to kosher the utensils. Now, this is, again, a very fundamental subject. Everyone knows about it year round, and also with Passover, we have to kosher our utensils for Passover. The basis of the laws of koshering, believe it or not, come from this week's Torah portion, because when it talks about how to deal with the different objects that they took from the spoils, the booty of the war with the Midianites, so Elazar, the high priest, instructed the soldiers how these are the laws of the Torah of how to kosher utensils, whether it's gold, whether it's silver, whether it's copper, whether it's iron, whether it is a tin, and various objects. And we all know, and this is again a lengthy subject, the laws of kosher. There's many ways to kosher things, with fire sometimes. Sometimes you don't need fire, you just need boiling hot water. Certain things cannot be koshered, like Scheiner, different things that are porous that they cannot be koshered, and so on and so forth. But without getting into all the laws of kosher right now, what is the psychological lessons that we can learn from the laws of kashrut? And I think there are three very important psychological lessons we could derive from the laws of kosher. The first lesson that we can learn from the laws of kosher is that, when you look at a non-kosher pot, a pot that was used to cook non-kosher food in it, there's nothing that meets the eye that you can see that it's not kosher. It's sort of like the pandemic we're living through now, right? You can't see the virus. Does that mean the virus doesn't exist? Of course the virus exists. Not everything that exists can be seen with the naked eye. There's much more to life than meets the eye. The eye is very powerful, but we can't see lots of things, just like you can't see electricity. But it exists because your computer turned on this morning. That means you have power, you have electricity. Could you see the electricity? Of course not. You can't see a virus, but tragically, the virus has already claimed over 500,000 lives in the world, tragically. For something that you can't even see, you need a microscope to see it, right? Same thing, someone says, I have a non-kosher pot. It looks clean. I cleaned it with soap and water. I even use chemicals. Says the Torah, there's certain particles, non-kosher substances that have seeped in and are embedded in the walls of the pot. Maybe your eye can't see it, but they need to be purged. They need to be cleansed. And there's ways to do it. With fire, with hot water, there's ways to purge it. Now, that's lesson number one, psychological lesson. Today, psychoanalysis is all based on the fact that every human being absorbed certain influences from childhood, whether positive or negative. And you may not see it because it's deep in the subconscious of the person. You may not even remember it consciously, okay? But a lot of times the problems we have in our life stem from earlier experiences, maybe trauma, maybe pain, that are trapped emotions, so to speak, embedded deep down in our psyche, in our soul, in our minds. And again, the whole idea of Freud and therapy, which is rooted in the Torah as well. I can't get into it right now, but the Torah has examples of subconscious mind having an influence on our conscious decisions and actions and speech. And sometimes we have to dig down and uncover what lies beneath the surface. And that's like the laws of koshering. Sometimes we have to extract, just like there's the non-kosher particles that have seeped their way into the pot, and the eye can't see it, but they're there, and they need to be purged. So too, whatever negative, toxic influences have gotten into our being, they now have to be removed and cleansed from our midst spiritually, psychologically, when it comes to our person. So the laws of kosher are a metaphor as well for our personal lives. That's rule number one. Rule number two, how do you extract the non-kosher particles? So the general rule is, and this is the rule in Jewish law, kibolo kach polto. The same method in which it absorbed it, that is the same method in which it extracts it. What does that mean? So let's say you have a pot where you cook non-kosher food in it with hot water. So you had a pot of water and you made non-kosher chicken soup. You had chicken that wasn't kosher, you put it in a pot with water and you made non-kosher chicken soup. So when you want to kosher this pot, you need to boil boiling hot water and let it extract through the heat the chicken soup flavor of the non-kosher chicken. What happens if you had a frying pan and you put a piece of non-kosher meat on the frying pan and you want to kosher it? Now you need a blowtorch to get it burning hot, with red heat, with a fire on the frying pan. Why can't you take the frying pan and just put it in boiling hot water? Because the rule is the same degree of heat that absorb the non-kosher particles and flavors is the same degree of heat that you need to extract it. With the boiling hot water, the chicken soup, it was boiling water that brought the flavors of the non-kosher chicken into the walls of the pot. So boiling hot water will extract it as well. But with the frying pan, the fire was directly on the surface. The meat was on the surface. It wasn't just absorbed in water. And therefore you need fire, a blowtorch. And the same thing is true with every form of koshering. But the general rule is the same degree of heat that absorbed it will extract it. And here we come to a second principle. Rabbi Nachman of Breslov once said a beautiful sentence that was turned into a song as well. Im ata mamin shata yachol lekalkel, ata tzarich lahamin shata yachol letaken, which means if you believe that you can destroy, that you have the power to destroy, you must also believe that you have this power to heal. In other words, if you could do damage, if you could destroy, then you must have the power to heal. That's the idea. Just like you could absorb the negative influences, so too you could spit it out. The literal terminology is kibolo, as it swallows it in, kach polto, so it spits it out. And this is a very fundamental principle in teshuvah. The Rambam says that anytime you regret your wrongdoing and you have sincere remorse, it's teshuvah, it's repentance. But what is teshuvah, ultimate repentance? Says Maimonides, ultimate repentance is when you are presented with the exact same opportunity. So let's say you cheated in business, God forbid, you stole money, and you want to do teshuvah. Well, first of all, you have to return the money, obviously, that goes without saying. But and then you have to regret it and have remorse and resolve never to do it again. But when the real teshuvah occurs? Next time you're in a business deal and you have a similar opportunity to deceive someone else, a customer or a client or a business associate, and this time you're honest and you say, no, I will not steal the money. I will be honest and have integrity. When you're presented with the identical challenge and you reject it, now you know your teshuvah is complete. As long as you just resolve not to do it again, that's not the full level of teshuvah. But when the same temptation comes again, and this time around you say, no, I won't do that bad deed again. Now you know your teshuvah is complete. And this is the second principle of koshering. The second principle of koshering is that the way you absorbed it, you could spit it out. Just like you've contracted this bad negative trait that you've absorbed into your being, whatever trait it is, let's say lashon hara. That's a common one, right? You're in a habit of speaking bad about people. Well, just like you've absorbed that negative trait, you could reject it, you could spit it out, you could cleanse yourself from it. Just like it came in, it can go out. Meaning, you could say, I want to discharge of this negative characteristic and remove it from my being. Because the same way in which it entered, it can exit, so to speak. Don't ever think that I'm damaged goods. I'm already scarred. I'm already harmed. I'm already absorbed this negative influence. Yes, there's no question what we experience damages us, harms us. What we see, what we hear, what we do has a permanent effect on us. But permanent in the sense that it's only permanent to the point that we determine that we want to rid ourselves of it. The minute we decide we don't want this influence to be a part of us anymore, we have the power, just like the koshering process, to reject it. And finally, the third principle of koshering that has a psychological message that we could apply to our lives. Jewish law says a sentence that says, when you're koshering something, let's say I take this pot that with non-kosher chicken soup was made in it, and now I want to kosher it. So I boil up boiling hot water and I let it overflow, and the boiling hot water purges it from the non-kosher influence. But the question is, why doesn't it go back in again? So the rule is, since the pot is busy spitting it out, it doesn't absorb it. Which means to say that psychologically and spiritually, when we're in a mode of doing something positive, we're in the positive mode, we're omitting or emitting, letting out positive influence. We can't absorb negative influence, which means the following, that when you're channeling light and goodness and you're emitting positive energy, you cannot absorb negative energy, which means the defense, they say, is a good offense. Sometimes the best way to fight negativity or evil is not by rejecting the evil merely, but by, on the contrary, going into a mode of positivity. And by doing good, automatically the negative will be banished. So when the evil inclination comes to a person, the Talmud says, and tries to seduce the person to commit a sin, you know what the Talmud's advice is? Drag him to the synagogue and the study hall. Because if you're engaged in prayer, you're engaged in Torah study, automatically, as you're doing that, he won't be able to influence you. So that is the third psychological lesson that we could learn about the laws of kosher. Continuing now to another subject that we find in this week's Torah portion, which is a fascinating story. And I know we're jumping from one thing to the next, but there's two Torah portions, so there's a lot to cover. We're now going to chapter 32 in the book of Numbers. And here we come to a third fascinating story in the Torah portion. And here the Jews have finished 40 years of wandering in the desert. They're about to go into the land of Israel. And we know that Moses was denied entry into the land of Israel because of the sin of hitting the rock. And as much as he prayed to God relentlessly to be forgiven for that sin and be allowed into the land of Israel, God rejected his plea. That's a separate subject. But here's what happens. There were 12 tribes of Israel, as we know. And they're about to enter into the land of Israel. The land would be divided up according to the tribes. Suddenly, two tribes approached Moshe Rabbeinu. And the names of the tribes were Reuven and Gad. And listen to what they say to Moshe Rabbeinu. They say to Moshe Rabbeinu, and this is again chapter 32, they say, you know, the land that we're dwelling in, which was in the Transjordan, on the other side, the east bank of the Jordan. This land, and the name of the land was Atarot, Divon, Yazer, Nimrah, Heshbon, Elaleh, Shavam, Uvo, Unevo, Vaon. These were the names of the territories they were dwelling in, the Jews were living in before they crossed over the Jordan into the land of Israel. They said, you know, this land that we're on right now is very fertile land. It's very good for the livestock, for the cattle. And we own a lot of cattle. So Moshe Rabbeinu, here's our request, they said. We know that God promised us the land of Israel, and we're supposed to go into the land of Israel to receive our portion in the land. But we prefer to stay right here. We will take our inheritance on the east bank of the Jordan, on these lands that we're now dwelling on, and rather than cross over the Jordan and enter Israel and take our portion in Israel. And Moshe Rabbeinu gets quite upset with these two tribes who present this request. And just to quote Moshe Rabbeinu, he says, are you going to allow your brothers, meaning the other 12 tribes, to go to battle to conquer the land of Israel while you sit comfortably on this side of the Jordan? Why would you weaken the hearts of the Jewish people and demoralize them from going over to the land of Israel to conquer the land? And then he says, this is the same sin, the same mistake that the spies made, the 12 spies, when they didn't want to go into the land of Israel. Are you going to repeat that same mistake? Because after all, that's why we were stranded for 40 years in the desert, because God got upset and said, this generation that left Egypt will never go into the land of Israel. So fascinatingly, Moshe Rabbeinu rebukes them very harshly. And these two tribes answer Moshe Rabbeinu and they say, no, that's not what we intended. What we want to do is go with the nation, cross over the Jordan, conquer the land of Israel. And after we conquer the land of Israel together with our brethren and we settle in the land of Israel, then we'll cross back over to the east bank of the Jordan and take our inheritance on the other side, outside of Israel. And when they stipulate and clarify their intentions that they don't want to be absolved from fighting the war of conquering the land of Israel, they just merely want to return back to this side eventually and take their inheritance on the east bank of the Jordan outside of Israel, Moshe agrees to their condition. And ultimately, that's what happens. These two tribes go over to Israel, conquer the land, and only later settle back on the other side of the Jordan outside of Israel. And that's a very fascinating story on many, many levels. The first level that it's fascinating is because today we know we have Jews in Israel and Jews in the diaspora outside of Israel. And the question is, why are we Jews in the diaspora? You have to ask yourself, why am I in Palm Beach? Why am I not in Israel? If there's a Jewish homeland, why am I not there? Or why am I anywhere else in the world? And here we have the first model of Jews saying, we don't want to live in Israel. We want to live on the other side of the Jordan. Now, when you ask yourself, why am I not in Israel? You say, well, I didn't choose to live here. My parents came to this country, or my grandparents came to this country. It wasn't my choice. It's not like I left, Europe 50, 60, 70 years ago, and I had to choose. I want to go to America. I want to go to Palestine. That wasn't my choice. My ancestors made this decision. I was born here, so this is where I got my education. This is where I know how to make a living, and this is where I live. But my heart is in Israel, so to speak. But here we have two tribes that had every opportunity to live in Israel. And they say, no, we want to live on the other side of the Jordan, which is fascinating. Now, there's two ways to look at this. One way is the literal verse, which is a negative way. What motivated these two tribes to want to live in the Transjordan? They say very clearly, this is good pasture for our cattle, which means their motive was materialistic. And they could have had a more sublime spiritual life in Israel. What could be better than living in the promised land that God promised our ancestors, Eretz Yisrael? But they had materialistic concerns, monetary concerns, cattle. They were worried about their cattle. And there's a great deal of discussion that we have to learn from these two tribes what not to do, not to place, because they actually say we'll build pens for our cattle and houses for our children, cities for our children. Our rabbis say, look at their wording. They put their animals before their children, meaning they valued their material possessions, their animals, their livestock, their wealth, before their well-being of their children's spiritual well-being. So rabbis say, from this we have to learn what not to do. And this doesn't only apply about living in the diaspora versus living in Israel. There's a Yiddish expression, Machda Eretz Yisrael, which means make Israel here. What does that mean? That means that wherever a Jew is, they have to bring the holiness of Israel to that place. So, to give you a very practical example, you could live in two different communities. One has a vibrant Jewish community, one doesn't. Well, one maybe is more economically beneficial for you to live in the non-Jewish community. You have to decide, do I want to place my livelihood as a priority, or do I want the well-being of my family and my children to be a priority? If I prioritize my business, then I'm better off in a non-Jewish community where I have a better opportunity to succeed. But if I prioritize my children, I want to live in a Jewish community, even if it means I'm not going to earn as much money. Or to give another example, kid goes off to college. Very common, right? And there's two universities. One has a very small Jewish population and Jewish life, but it's a better university. The kid could maybe succeed more in the long term by going to this prestigious university. The other university is maybe not as prestigious, but there's a much greater Jewish life, more chances they're going to meet a Jewish boy or a Jewish girl and start a Jewish family. Again, it's a question of priorities. So the two tribes teach us what not to do, which is don't prioritize your animals, your livestock, your material wealth and possessions over the well-being of your children, your family, your spiritual pursuits. That's the literal way to read the story, and it has a very practical lesson. But there are two very deep spiritual ways to understand the story. There are two very spiritual ways to understand the story that I want to focus on, that these two tribes actually had a very positive motive. Not to see them in a negative light and condemn them, but to see them in a positive light. But before I get to the positive light, there's something else that I must tell you about the story, because there's another major principle. About this story that is derived in Jewish law, that is very much in force in our day-to-day Jewish life. And it is as follows. One of the verses that Moshe Rabbeinu says to the tribes is, if you go into the land of Israel and fight the war alongside the Jewish people, conquer the land, and then return to the other Transjordan, you will be clean in the eyes of God and the eyes of the Jewish people. V'yisem nikiyim melokim Yisrael. You'll be clean, you'll be vindicated, you'll be absolved in the eyes of God and the Jewish people. Meaning to say that it's not enough for you to be absolved or pure or clean or righteous in the eyes of God. You also have to be righteous in the eyes of your fellow man. If you don't go over to the land of Israel, you will be looked down upon by your fellow Jews who will say, look, they didn't come to fight the war with us. Therefore, a Jew, according to Jewish law, has to always realize, every person, that what we do has to be good in the eyes of Hashem and in the eyes of our fellow man. Sometimes people make a mistake and they say, well, I don't care what people think about me. It doesn't matter that people think negative. That's not the reason why you should care. You should care because if someone's perceiving something you did negatively, they're being influenced by it, because we all are influenced by one another. So when you see other people doing good, you're inspired to do good. When you see other people doing bad, it has a negative effect on you as well. So the point here is that we have to be clean in the eyes of Hashem and in the eyes of our fellow men. So I'll give you a very practical example of this. Let's say someone says to you, can you come with me to McDonald's for lunch? You say, well, I eat kosher, I don't eat at McDonald's. They say, oh, they sell salad there. You could have a salad, natural, it's kosher, just come and eat salad. Can you go eat salad at McDonald's or any other non-kosher restaurant? And I see Elisa's shaking her head no. And the answer is no. And the question is, why not? I'm eating only a salad. I'll even bring my own salad to eat from my house. And the answer is, somebody will walk by the store in the window and see you, a nice Jewish person, eating in McDonald's, and say, oh, she eats at McDonald's or he eats at McDonald's. Maybe it's not so bad. Maybe I should also give it a try. So you'll have a negative impact on somebody. People will judge you in the wrong way. That can influence them. So we have to make sure that we don't do anything that could be misinterpreted as though we've done something wrong. Somebody say, well, I know I didn't do anything wrong. Doesn't matter what other people think about me. And the answer is, it does matter, because they will be influenced by you. So that's a principle. So I'll give you one more practical example. If you are having a meat dinner at your house and you invite guests to your house and you serve coffee and tea at the end and you want to put out creamer, so you may take the creamer and put it in a little glass and put it on the table. Jewish law says don't do that. Put it on the table in the container. Why? Because someone may say, oh, they just serve chicken and meat, and now they're having milk with their coffee. They don't eat milk. They don't keep kosher. They mix milk and meat. So unless someone misinterprets it, you shouldn't just put the creamer in a glass jar that somebody could think it's milk. Put it out in the container so everyone knows that it's non-dairy creamer and you're not mixing milk and meat. It's important to not do anything that will be perceived in a negative light because it may influence other people. Going back to the story of the two tribes of Gad and Reuven, why would they want to stay on the east on the east bank of the Jordan? I mean, after all, they journeyed 40 years to get to the land of Israel. Were they so materialistic that they placed the well-being of their financial interests of their cattle before they're wanting to go into the land of Israel? After all, Moses prayed relentlessly to go into Israel and was denied it, and now they're saying, we don't even want to go into the land of Israel, we'd rather live here. So a positive approach, sometimes people come with a request and we prejudge them rather than realize what their real motive is. Their motive was that they were saying, it's not enough for Jews and Judaism to be in the land of Israel. What about the rest of the world? They wanted to create a bridge between the holiness of Israel and the rest of the world. They said, by us remaining on the other side of the Jordan, we will be the conduit to bring the godliness, to bring the holiness, to bring the sanctity of Israel to the rest of the world. Like I said, the Yiddish expression, make Israel here, mach da Eretz Yisrael. This summer, a lot of people are upset. Disappointed, I should say, they can't go to Israel because of the coronavirus. The message this summer is, it's not about going to Israel. It's about bringing the holiness and the spirit of Israel to the rest of the world. They were the first model of diaspora Jewry. That a Jew's mission is not exclusively relegated to Israel. God doesn't just want his presence to dwell in one country. He wants that one country to be the generator that exudes the light. Ki mitzion tetzeh Torah, from Zion shall Torah go forth, and the word of Hashem from Jerusalem to the rest of the world. So the Jews have to be spread out in the four corners of the world to bring the Torah values of Judaism to the rest of the world. It derives from Israel and the holiness of Israel, the Holy Land, but it has to be transmitted throughout the whole world. These two tribes were the first model, the precedent of this idea that yes, there are Jews in Israel. The majority of Jews live in Israel today, but there still has to be a minority of Jewish communities around the world, just like the original dwelling in the land of Israel came with two tribes that were outside of the boundaries of Israel to bring that holiness of Israel to the rest of the world. And that's something that I think Israel strives today for, to have a connection with Jews around the world and to bring Jewish values and Jewish ideas and Jewish innovation and creativity and genius from Israel to spread it around the whole world. And that is the first model of these two tribes, Gad and Reuven, who superficially they said, oh, we have livestock, we want to live on the other side of the Jordan, but their deeper motivation was to bridge the Israel community to the diaspora community. Because throughout history, there would always be Jews in the diaspora and exile, and therefore there had to be a precedent, a model of a connectivity between Jews in Israel with Jews outside of Israel, like the initial 10 tribes in Israel, but 2 tribes dwelling outside of Israel. But yet a deeper Hasidic insight to what motivated these 2 tribes. We all know, we discussed before, Moshe Rabbeinu led the Jews from Egypt to the Promised Land for 40 years, and he struck the rock and he was punished. he wasn't fit to carry on. Joshua had to lead the Jews into the land of Israel. And Moshe Rabbeinu dies at Mount Nebo on the east bank of the Jordan. And fascinatingly, he pleads, according to our rabbis, 515 prayers to be allowed into Israel, and God refuses to grant that wish. And he is indeed laid to rest. Nobody knows his burial place because God didn't want us to deify him, so nobody knows his resting place till this very day. So Hasidic interpretation says like this: why did these two tribes want to stay on the east bank of the Jordan? Because they did not want to abandon their teacher, their leader. They said, how could we leave Moses to die on this side of the Jordan without entering Israel? Imagine if all 12 tribes left the east bank of the Jordan and crossed over into Israel and remained there. Moses' burial place would be isolated from the rest of the Jewish people. They said, we love our teacher too much. We want to remain with a Jewish community, a Jewish presence around his burial place. When I think today about Hebron, maybe 500 families who live in Hebron, near the patriarchs and the matriarchs' tomb burial place. If you ever visit Hebron, it's not an easy place to live in because you're surrounded by millions of Arabs there. It's a very hostile, dangerous place. And you say, why do these Jews? They could live in Petach Tikva, they could live in Tel Aviv, they could live in Jerusalem, they could live in Bnei Brak, beautiful Jews. What are they living out in Hebron for? They have to take armored cars and buses just to travel there. And the answer is because they said, well, we can't leave the patriarchs and the matriarchs to be alone amongst the Arabs without a Jewish community. We want to go pray 3 times a day at the cave of the patriarchs and matriarchs. And like this, there could be access for the rest of the Jews in Israel and or tourists who come from America to go to Hebron because there's a community living there. Same thing, these two tribes said, we love to go to Israel. Nothing would make us happier than to be in Israel. Of course, every Jew wants to be in Israel, but we'll sacrifice and remain here just to keep a Jewish presence at the burial place of Moshe Rabbeinu, so he's not alone here. And now we understand why they talked about their livestock. They can't come to Moshe and say, Moshe, since you're going to die and you're going to be here, we want to be here with you. So they camouflage their request by saying, oh, we want to stay here. There's more cattle. There's more of this. There's more of that. But really their true motive was so much greater. Their motive was to remain with Moshe Rabbeinu. I'll never forget Rabbi Riskin during the days of the Intifada, when Israel was being bombed with suicide buses and, bombs on buses and cafes, and tourism practically came to a screeching halt. Jews from around the world stopped coming to Israel. It's too dangerous. And Rabbi Riskin said, what's the difference between Disneyland and the motherland or fatherland, right? He says, when your mother is, God forbid, ill, or your mother is in danger, that's precisely when you go visit her. Disneyland, you go when the weather is nice, when it's a good time to go, convenient time to go. But Israel is not. If Israel's Disneyland, you go when things are good. But if Israel's the motherland, when your mother needs you, that's when you go. When the Jews are being bombed and attacked in Israel, that's when Jews should come and show support more than ever. That's what the Jews of the tribes of Gad and Reuben were saying, is we want to be with our leader, and therefore we will remain here. We now go to the second Torah portion, which is the Ma'aseh, which is the last Torah portion of the book of Numbers, the book of Bamidbar, and it begins with chapter 33. And it begins with the recounting of the 42 encampments where the Jews rested along their journey of 40 years in the desert. Sometimes they stayed in a place for a short time, for days or weeks or months, sometimes for years. But overall, over the 40 years, they encamped in 42 locations. And the very first Rashi says, why does the Torah recount the 42 locations? Why doesn't the Torah just say, we went through the 42 journeys over the whole book. Why does it have to be recounted at this point? Why is it all listed again? They went from here to there, to there, to there. Why do we have to know all this? And Rashi says something beautiful. Rashi says, like a story of a king who was taking his son on a journey, and the son was ill. They were going to travel to doctors. And when they got to the doctor and they were healed, they went back on the journey. And the father showed the son in each location, the prince. Remember, here you had a fever. Here you had a headache. Here you had the chills. In other words, he recounts everything that they went through on the way back, which now in hindsight they could appreciate the fact that they've been cured from this illness and appreciate their healing even more. So too, Moshe Rabbeinu is now showing the Jews in hindsight how all the struggles and all the journeys that the Jews went through, and they went through a lot of hardships in the desert, physical, spiritual, sins, challenges, snakes, scorpions, lack of water, lack of food, the golden calf, sin of the spies, the rebellion of Korah. How now in hindsight they can appreciate how all of that led them to the promised land. And it's a metaphor for all of our lives that we all go through challenges in life. We all go through hardships. And sometimes when we're going through, we don't appreciate it. We don't understand it. We say, why are we having this challenge? But, Moshe Rabbeinu, when he said to God, let me see your face, God said, you could see my back, you can't see my face. And one of the explanations by Chassam Sofer is we can't always see God's ways as we're going forward. But in hindsight, you could see my back. You can now understand how that experience led you to something greater. And so too in all of our lives, sometimes we can't appreciate or perceive the benefit of something as we're going, enduring it, as we're experiencing it. But sometimes we can look back in hindsight 5 years later, 10 years later, whatever it is, and say, oh, now I see why I had to go through that, how that led me to a higher plateau, to a better place in my life, how what I thought at the time was negative actually turned out to be something positive. So that's the recounting of the 42 journeys and all the challenges that it endured, that they experienced. Another fascinating thing in this week's Torah portion is there's only one yahrzeit that's recorded in the Torah. There's only one biblical figure that the Torah tells us the day he died. Most of the other yahrzeits we know from the rabbinic tradition, like Moshe Rabbeinu died on the 7th of Adar, but that's not recorded in the Torah. The only person that we're told who died and the day he died is Aaron, the brother of Moses. And this week's Torah portion says he died on the first day of the month of Av. Now, interestingly, Rosh Chodesh Av will be this coming week on, God willing, on Wednesday of next week, we'll have Rosh Chodesh Av. And the question is, why is this the one biblical figure that we're told the day of his passing? And a very beautiful idea and thought is that Aaron, we know, is a peacemaker. He was a man who loved peace, who pursued peace, who loved mankind and drew them closer to the Torah. It says in Pirkei Avot, whoever is well liked by others is beloved by God as well. How do you know if God loves somebody? What do people think about this person? If people think highly of this person, people love this person, people appreciate this person, then you know God loves them as well. So public opinion, so to speak, is what determines our favorability in the eyes of Hashem, okay? So, because if people like you, that means you're doing something right. You must be a good person, which means that Hashem likes you as well, okay? So, Aaron dies on the first day of the month of Av. Now, we know that we're in the 3 weeks now, and Rosh Chodesh Av is the day that begins the mourning for the destruction of the temple, the 9 days, which leads to Tisha B'Av, the day that the temples were destroyed, right? I'm sorry, here, let me just fix this. The days that the temples were destroyed. Aaron was a peacemaker, and his death on the first day of Av is telling us, rabbis say God always introduces the cure before the illness. And therefore, our rabbis say that Aaron is the paradigm, the model for what does it mean to be a peace-loving person. And the way we will rectify the sin of baseless hatred that led to the destruction of the temple is by practicing the ways of Aaron, by being followers and disciples of Aaron who practice unconditional love for every person. And that is the message of Aaron's passing on Rosh Chodesh Av, that when we begin the 9 days of mourning of the destruction of the temple, we should remember that the way we will merit the rebuilding of the temple and the healing of our fractured world and society is by practicing the attributes of Aaron, which was to be peace-loving, to love our fellow man as ourselves, and to draw people closer to God and to the Torah. And that leads us to the last subject of the Torah portion of Maseh that we will discuss here, and that is the cities of refuge. The Torah portion discusses someone who killed someone accidentally. Now, this is not a bad person. This is a person who committed an accident. But there was a tinge of negligence in the accident. So, for example, The Torah says a man was chopping wood and the axe flew off the handle and killed a man. Now, God forbid, he didn't intend to kill anyone. It was an accident. But he could have checked his equipment before he chopped wood to make sure that everything's attached well. So, intentional murderer in the Torah gets capital punishment in biblical times if there were witnesses and warning and so on and so forth. But here we're talking about somebody who killed accidentally. And here the Torah says if it was an unintentional accident, but maybe you could have been more careful that it could have been avoided, you have to run to the city of refuge. City of refuge were the cities of the Levites, the priests and the Levites. And it was a very spiritually infused city. And you would live there to be rehabilitated from what you have done. Now, to make this example modern, most of us don't go into the forest to chop wood with an axe and the axe goes flying off the handle. But think about a car accident, God forbid. A person is driving a car, and God forbid it should never happen to anyone. He accidentally kills somebody, runs somebody over, God forbid. Or gets into a car accident and he hits somebody, God forbid, right? So the guilt, the feeling of remorse, even if it was unintentional, is awful. Now, obviously, there are cases where it was accidental, but it's considered as though it was intentional. So a person drinks and drives. Well, if you drink and drive, you didn't intend to kill anyone, but when you get in your car after drinking, it's what we call shogeg karav lamezid, which means it's unintentional, but it is intentional because you did something reckless by getting into a car after you went to the bar and drank. That's considered murder in some cases. But I'm talking about a real accident. Now, again, if you were going speeding 100 miles an hour on the highway, 90 miles an hour, you get into a car accident, that's considered almost intentional, okay? But let's say you were not speeding, but you took your eye off the road for a second, or today we have texting and driving or things like that. You can imagine the guilt of a person thinking, I could have been more careful. I should have not picked up the phone while I was driving, or whatever it may be. And the person is living with terrible remorse and guilt, and therefore becomes the responsibility of the Kohanim and the Levites to help this person live again, to find meaning in life, to find happiness in life, because a person could plunge into sadness or depression. But I just want to share with you the spiritual message of cities of refuge, because today we don't have the cities of refuge anymore. And what the Torah is saying is like this, that a person has to find refuge from their sins. If people made mistakes in life, right? People could live with deep regret and remorse. And sadly, it doesn't mean that, God forbid, you killed anyone, but maybe there's regret for other areas of your life. That mistakes you've made that left permanent irreparable damage in one area of life or another. And the Torah says that you have to find refuge. How do you find refuge? You find refuge by going into the study of Torah and the performance of good deeds. The Kohen and the Levite cities represent cities of holiness, of sanctity, of godliness. And by the Jew is like a dead, you killed somebody, God forbid, you feel dead inside. You feel horrible. You feel terrible remorse and guilt. How could you live again? By connecting to the priests and to the Levites and to the Torah and the mitzvot. And the lesson is no one should ever, God forbid, know from such a tragedy, but on a more minor scale, if you've made mistakes in life, you've committed sins, you've done certain things that are wrong, it doesn't mean that life has to end. You could live again, is what the Torah is saying. How do you live again? By connecting to the Kohanim, to the Levites, to the teachers, to the spiritual guides. There's a fascinating law that says, Talmud Shagala Maglan Rabbi Imo, that if a student is exiled because of killing someone unintentionally, his teacher has to go teach him Torah there, because now he needs Torah more than ever. And so too, every person makes mistakes in life. Every person could look back, but instead of living life in the rearview mirror and looking back and wallowing in regret and sadness, we have to realize that we have to go forward and we have to live. And sometimes we could take the mistakes of the past and use them as a catalyst to inspire us to achieve even more greatness in our lives and do even more good. Out of the negativity, out of the pain, something positive and good can come. And it should never be, God forbid, in a terrible way or in a painful way, God forbid, something as terrible as what the Torah portion talks about, actual killing someone unintentionally. But every person could look back at mistakes they've made, and instead of doing what the evil inclination does, which is the tactic to draw you down and make you depressed over your past misdeeds, you have to say, how can I go to the city of refuge? How can I find an environment, a community, a space in life that connects me to a higher degree of holiness and goodness and righteousness, so that from that past negative experience, I can reach even a higher level. Instead of it becoming a stumbling block, it becomes a stepping stone to reach even higher. And the greatest refuge is Torah and mitzvahs, good deeds, and prayer and connection to to Torah and environment of Jewish life. That is the refuge, the modern day refuge, where we could all find our own refuge from anything that plagues us, any sins, any mistakes that we've made in the past. So this is the way we conclude the double Torah portion. There's other things going on in the Torah portion, obviously, but these were some of the major themes of this week's Torah portion. So I wish everyone a good day, and I know most of us, or all of us, will be at home this Shabbat. Remember, when we finish the book, we always say the three words, Chazak, Chazak, V'nis Chazek. Let us strengthen ourselves, re-strengthen ourselves, and become ever stronger. During these days, we all need extra strength to get through the challenges that we're all dealing with. May God grant us that strength, and may we continue to go from strength to strength until we emerge even stronger and greater from these challenges that we're experiencing. Have a beautiful day, everyone, and love to everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you for joining me, and have a beautiful day, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi. You too.
Thank you for joining the class.